Thank you for joining us on this episode of MSP-1337, a podcast dedicated to helping MSPs and their clients navigate cybersecurity. Cybersecurity is a journey, but it doesn't mean you have to travel alone. I'm your host, Chris Johnson, and before we get started, I'd like to take a moment to thank our sponsor, Pinpoint Solutions, a consulting firm dedicated to providing cybersecurity leadership and guidance to MSPs and their clients. Think of us as your virtual CISO or security advisor. Head on over to pinpointsolutions.com to find out more. Now on with the show. Welcome, everybody, to this episode of MSP 1337. This week, I'm joined by Kenneth May of Swift Chip Consulting. Thanks for joining us, Ken.
Thanks for having me, Chris.
Hey, so this episode, for those that know you, in your arena, you're heavily involved in cybersecurity. And I think that while I like the idea of getting involved in things like vulnerability assessments and penetration testing and, say, the blue red team type exercise, I like the idea, which is a whole lot different than where I think you're at, where you are doing this stuff, and I applaud you for it because it's just not my cup of tea. But this is why talking earlier, why I wanted you to be on the show is primarily because a lot of MSPs are struggling with two concepts. One, the difference between penetration tests and vulnerability assessments, because obviously a penetration test includes vulnerability assessment. It is built on a vulnerability assessment. So vulnerability assessment is not the same as pen test, but a pen test is a vulnerability assessment with more.
Yeah.
And then the second one is the mindset that says, I'm not big enough to need this done on either my organization or my clients. And I think I'd like to, as we go through this, I'd like to address any MSP that thinks that they don't need one at all, because I think that really gets more into a maturity component. So I would also defend them on the one hand that says, yes, at your current maturity level, doing a penetration test is going to merit the same result as we already know is the state of your environment. So let's not, if the house of cards is a house of cards, let's not knock them over.
Right.
So as we were talking before the show, and by the way, for those of you who don't know, Ken and I go way back. We were in the first MSP-Ignite peer group that was ever formed. And
I was there at the beginning when it all started.
And that's been close to a decade now. Like, we are literally coming up on, it's been what, 8 years? 8 years, I think. So wow. A lot of history between us. We spent a lot of time talking shop, and I have to say, of the people that are out there that I know, there are a few that can touch Ken when it comes to the understanding of what goes into truly penetration testing.
That's very good.
Well, hey, I wouldn't ask you on the show if I didn't think you had the chops for it. So we're going to ask some hard questions, I'm sure, at some point here.
Good.
All right. So the first question, and I think this is probably one of the most important questions, is I'm just going to start sort of backwards of how I started the conversation. And that is, talk to me about vulnerability assessment and penetration testing in the context of an MSP, like the importance of it. And maybe Sure. That's vague, but I'll start there and we'll see what we need to do to narrow it down.
Yeah. So for the MSP itself, we've seen such a huge increase in the targeted attacks of MSPs themselves and the supply chain. Looking at SolarWinds, looking at Kaseya, looking at some other MSP specific vendors that have been specifically targeted by APTs, advanced persistent threats, and other hacking groups out there, that it's more critical than ever that the MSPs themselves get their own house in order before they really can be confident in taking care of their own clients. So not only getting regularly assessed, but also pen tested, I think is absolutely mandatory. And it's a good idea to do sort of your own scan of yourself, but it can't be fully objective, right? It's not going to really stand up. So finding a good organization to work with that can do assessments and pen tests of your own environment, I think is critical if you want to have it hold up to any sort of scrutiny. And that's just the first thing before we even start talking about their clients.
Well, so let's pause right there for a second, because I think there's two things that work here with an MSP. One is the idea that most MSPs are not very big, right?
I mean,
Most
you and I are both pretty active in the industry. I'm not sure exactly what the truth is of the average size of an MSP, but I mean, I've seen one-man shops call themselves MSPs, and there are MSPs out there with hundreds of employees.
But by and large, we also could say the same thing about the SMB space, but we all kind of accept that if there's less than 200 employees, which I think in the MSP space, that'd be a really big SMB.
It would be a pretty good size.
So if we were talking about, say, where we're comfortable, let's just say that most of our clients are somewhere between 5 and 25 employees is our client base, regardless of how big our MSP is. So if I think about that, and I actually had this conversation earlier with another opportunity, and he and I were kind of going back and forth of the organization, the MSP isn't just that entity, right? Because all of your clients that you have tentacles into for the different services you offer are kind of like different departments in an organization that's much larger. So if you were to take that and go, okay, well, how big is the organization now that I've got all these pieces that I flow into, or stuff comes into me? How big is my company now? One might argue in a lot of cases, you're almost of enterprise size. So
an interesting approach to that, not one I've really seen much of.
And I'm only saying that to just say that there is a factor that makes the MSP bigger than the actual MSP, because
absolutely,
those clients have the tool sets flow in and out of each other, which makes us, one could argue if we're in the same building on different floors, okay, maybe that's a little bit more separation. But when we're in the same building and we share the same workout room and conference rooms, I guess that's where I'm kind of going with this. So as you evaluate,
certainly it targets the attractiveness of the organization, right?
Right. So
from an attacker's perspective,
absolutely, which is part of, that's where I wanted to go with this. See, I knew there was a reason why I had you come on, is like you already knew where I was going. So following what you were saying earlier is, okay, now take that same thought process and say, me, the MSP first, how big am I really? What's my threat surface really?
Right.
So, but keep going, because I think this is where we're at. I just wanted to pause there because I think that there's some value in saying no MSP can say that they're too small with regards to doing this, getting the house in order, like you said.
Well, absolutely. And keeping in mind that an MSP, no matter the size, is still a link in the supply chain. It's incredibly critical. I've done pen tests and I've done vulnerability assessments for companies as small as 3 people before. And it's a completely different creature because obviously you don't have quite the same level of complexity as you would typically see.
Sure.
But it might be just as critical. One client I had worked with, they manufactured infrared sensors for the Army. And so you can imagine that if they had been compromised, that there could be some significant national security concerns with that. They were a sole supplier, in fact.
Sure.
So no size is too small for a pen test, although it may be somewhat onerous for the organization. And a lot of the things might not apply. It might be just as critical.
Right. So this goes into what does that look like? So when you think about what's triggering the reasons behind it, right? So if I need a vulnerability assessment, I need a pen test, what are the drivers? So like if you're talking about like a DoD, those types of things, just because we're talking about what all might be included in a traditional penetration test doesn't mean the actual penetration test looks exactly the same as what's sort of assumed by the framework or the overall theme that may be being requested by whoever says you got to have a pen test done.
Yeah, exactly.
And so getting buy-in on that is also important, right? Like I can't just say, hey, let's go ahead and do the test, and we're only gonna do these 3 things because you use Dropbox and in G Suite, and that's it. Your firewalls are non-existent in the context of what's being asked here. You still probably need to go back to the organization requesting that the pen test is being done and say, hey, this is our environment. Does this will this satisfy your request? Because obviously there's a significant cost to just go and do and then find out wasn't enough.
Well, it depends on the goals too. Certainly, that would be the initial concern: is can we make this work? But another concern then too, from a security standpoint, is it allows us with a smaller organization to be even more targeted and more focused in determining how much damage can happen from an attack, especially when we're dealing with it from a very limited range focus on who in the supply chain might be then targeted upstream, right? So
Sure.
in that particular example, we were able to be very focused in saying, okay, exactly what kind of damage could happen here if somebody clicks on a link.
I think that's a really important way of saying that. So I think about, and everybody who's listening is going to totally resonate this statement, but remember the target breach? I don't know that one can probably create a pretty solid argument that said Target had a pretty solid security program, and to a large degree, it was being executed well. But that stops when you think about their supply chain and that link probably not being a very big link, but still a link on an organization that, program or not, was not at where it needed to be. And it was the vulnerability and the breach, but that doesn't remove the responsibility or obligations of Target of ensuring that that was a secure environment. So,
Right.
Talk to that a little bit, because I think that's like where you're kind of going, is like, we're in the supply chain, and we're in a supply chain that's not just one chain link. Like, it's more like a key ring with lots of keys hanging off of it. And then, still upstream from us, like, who are they targeting? Is it someone in our client pool and they're coming through us? Is it someone in our client pool and they're going through one of our clients to get through us to get to that client? Which goes back to my statement about, we're a lot bigger than we think when we look at it through the lens of all the things that intertwine.
Yeah. Well, and another aspect of that too is, ideally, we're certainly focused objectively on making sure that security is front and forward, and we want to make sure that all of our clients are as secure as possible. But the reality is that reputation management is a key part of that too, and the clients don't care that it was my HVAC contractor's subcontractor who got breached and then caused us to get breached. All they know is that they're our client, and now their data is at risk.
Right. So no matter how great your indemnification clause, your MSA with the client, it doesn't indemnify your reputation.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. It's still getting pointed, all those fingers still getting pointed back at us, right? So it makes it even more important for a variety of different reasons. And it's unfortunate that it's fairly common that I will still come across businesses where they're at least beginning the conversation now, which is multiple steps forward than it had been in the past, as I'm sure you've experienced. Sure. But even still, we sometimes see businesses that it's more like, well, this is a box that they told us we need to check, so we're trying to check that box, as opposed to actually having any sort of a direct care for the outcome. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's like the age-old argument of, does compliance drive the outcome, or is security best practices driving the outcome? And neither one of those drivers are necessarily wrong, but if the outcome doesn't satisfy security in that process, then it doesn't matter, right?
Yeah, we all got to focus on secure outcomes, right?
That's right. That's right. So let's shift gears. Let's talk a little bit about, when does it make sense versus not, as far as like a vulnerability assessment, and then going beyond that to a penetration test. And let's talk about it in twofold. First one is, as an MSP, vulnerability assessment on myself. Obviously, we should do those on a regular basis ourselves. Obviously, it's not objective, but it's still informative and it gives us data to work with. And then the second part of that is, when does it make sense to involve a third party, whether it's just vulnerability or penetration? And then the second part of that would be like, let's talk about it when we look at our clients.
Okay. So a lot of times, like you said, people still seem to confuse the terms, right? And we'll get approached for a pen test from a company that's never had one before.
Right.
And I'll talk to them about, tell me about your security posture. Tell me about what sort of assessments you've had in the past. And oftentimes they haven't really had anything done.
Just do one.
Yeah. So I'll tell them, look, I'm happy to take your money, but keep in mind, a pen test is significantly more labor intensive, and has a much higher cost component. And if you've never even had a vulnerability assessment done, I can pretty much guarantee you're going to fail. So probably what's in your best interest, unless this is specifically a requirement for some project or something like that, or a compliance thing where we just have to do it anyway. It's okay if we fail, we just have to do it. It might be better to start off with something like a simpler vulnerability assessment, knock out all the low-hanging fruit, dramatically and much more quickly improve our security posture. And then we can come back around and do a pen test later. That's fine. But there's sort of no sense in buying a really fancy security system for your house if the power's not even hooked up yet, right?
That was really good. I really like that. That resonates. That should resonate with everybody. That's like remodeling a house you don't yet own.
Good for the next guy, I guess.
Right. It depends. Like if that deal falls through during the closing, and you already started your remodel process, well, it may end up a pretty good deal for the person that didn't sell the house.
Right. In regards to when is it appropriate to bring in a third party, I would say the answer is pretty similar for both testing yourself as well as your clients. It's not a bad idea, again, to do sort of your own testing, just so you can find low-hanging fruit, easy, quick fixes, take care of all that stuff. Makes you look a lot better, especially to the client, because they see like you're being proactive and you've got security on the mind. But then very quickly, whatever your regularly scheduled interval should be, you're going to need to have it happening with a third party, so that way they can objectively find the things that you might have missed. And even if they don't find anything you missed, even if they find less stuff, it's important, I think, to be able to show that you passed an audit by somebody who can have that sort of distance there.
Right. The unbiased of you. And do you really see that someone passes, or is it more like you found that the gaps or holes were not significant enough to merit, punishing them for the current state of affairs?
So it depends on whether they're being held to a compliance framework. If they're being held to, say, CMMC or FINRA, DFARS, whatever, HIPAA, then you can say there's a pass-fail component insofar as there's gaps, right? Where they're simply not compliant. But even outside of that, I think one can say, okay, well, there may be a situation where we were unable to successfully actually penetrate the client. That being said, we have to keep in mind that we approach every engagement from a threat modeling perspective.
Okay.
And that's very rarely happening. I've been finding people are like, we need a vulnerability assessment. I say, okay, why? And tell me what we're modeling here. Like, what are you talking about? Well,
when you say that, are you saying like, have they done any sort of like business impact analysis? Like what are
that's a key part of it, but there needs to be some kind of intelligence on what sort of threats are they facing? Are we going to focus our tests from the perspective, from threat modeling, a disgruntled internal employee and what sort of damage they could potentially cause? Or are we going to focus on a business email compromise? Because they're very different approaches and we may have very different outcomes. And
do we limit it? Do we limit it to that? I mean, I think about like,
not necessarily.
Like what happens if a tree falls on my building and destroys my servers?
Right.
Like, does that factor into this, or is that not where this goes?
Well, I wouldn't. That would be something more under like a IRDR,
okay,
CDR sort of a situation.
That makes sense. Yeah.
Which is a different type of tabletop exercise that we might do. But what this really more points to is a couple things: helping determine whether it should be a black box or crystal box test. That is. Attacking it completely blind, or having some pre-informed info, possibly already starting from an assumption of compromise. That is, let's assume that somehow an email is going to get through that one of my employees is going to click on.
Sure.
From that standpoint, what sort of damage can happen? Should we already assume that after that event has happened, that the attacker has been able to gain administrative credentials?
Okay.
From that standpoint, what sort of damage can happen? right?
So
Because
basically it's
with
stepping
attacks
in.
like pass the hash and Kerberoasting and all sorts of these different things, you know, I mean, it may be trivial to be able to gain to do privilege escalation.
So sort of splitting this in between vulnerability versus penetration. And the vulnerability assessment, where you're sort of identifying potentially that threat level and the impact, right? So like you clicked on email, where did that put us? What can be happen here? And then the next level up. Do you use that then to help, say, the MSP identify like, hey, the probability of these first two happening is very high. So your protection level here needs to be like through the roof. The probability of the elevation happening for this third one is really only going to happen if these two are not being protected well at all.
So that ties into something we talk about early on in the GSCC certification stuff from SANS. I think it's day one stuff, the definition of terms, right? So we define risk as degree of impact versus probability of occurrence, right?
Sure.
Or at least that's one definition of it. And, you know, if there's a very low probability it's going to happen, even though it could impact quite a bit, it may not be a very big risk for us.
Right.
So, for example, tsunami, right? I mean, it would be devastating if it happened, but all of our offices are in Colorado. So, you know, if a tsunami actually affected us, then we got much bigger problems going on.
Right. We that would be a different kind of natural disaster.
That's right. That's right. Now, of course, that's more of a incident response sort of example, but to help illustrate the same sort of idea.
But backing up for a second in what you just said, I liken that though to when we say the probability of happening and all of those things, this also factors in this other element that I have started saying a lot, and that is we need to focus less on risk elimination and focus more on risk reduction, because so many MSPs get stuck in this mindset that says, I can't eliminate this, so why try?
Well, that's a horrible, I mean, that's,
but you hear it all the time.
Fundamental misunderstanding of anything to do with security.
Okay, so let's use some examples though that we know to be true. Let's think about email for a second and phishing campaigns. How many organizations spend a lot of energy on phishing campaigns because their mindset is they're going to get phished at some point anyways. So how much am I really investing in this? And I would argue you're right. At some point, we are all going to be victims of phishing, because inevitably we are programmed to click on the link. And at some point in time, you will get an email that passes muster as far as convincing me that I should click on this. And shoot, it could be as simple as a text message with a link in it that puts me on this path towards compromise. But the reality is, if our focus is on reduction of risk, then ultimately that will also factor into risk elimination. Because it's like talking about COVID-19. If we said, well, I'm not going to get vaccinated because the probability of me getting it is only so high because everybody else got vaccinated. Okay, I could see that argument if that tide is rising where you've got that happening. But then you've got the other side of it. If it still happened, what's the risk of you dying? And you don't know that because it's an unknown risk.
So that's a great example of why there is a significant difference between a vulnerability assessment and a penetration test, right? So vulnerability assessment is going to say you have all these risks. Now, if we're following principles such as defense in depth and properly attributing to zero trust and following principles of least privilege, all that sort of stuff, then a pen test is going to show, okay, let's exploit that vulnerability. Now what?
Right.
Well, maybe nothing, right? So maybe I'm able to successfully do an authentication bypass and join the guest Wi-Fi network, but there's client isolation and I'm not able to hop VLANs or break out of it. So really, there's not much risk there at all. So on a pen test, we might be able to say like, okay, well, you know, we were able to get past here, but we weren't able to pivot and do anything from it.
Yeah, that'd be like, I'm not saying that I'm doing this, but let's just say, hypothetically speaking, considering where I live, rural Iowa, I didn't have password on my Wi-Fi. You know,
you gotta watch out for those hacker cows, you know?
Right. Like moo. Yeah. I mean, if you think about it, in some cases, security through obscurity can actually be a very valid thing when you go, the probability of this happening.
Sorry, I just cringed a little bit.
I know. But the probability of it happening is so low, like you said, like the elevations of what we're looking at, and then you go, okay, well, what's the cost to the organization to lock that down? And you may find that, hey, there is no financial scenario where they can afford to do this, and it's an acceptable risk.
Yeah, so, I think as long as it's documented, that's the key thing. It needs to be able to be shown, we did come across this risk. We know this risk exists, but for these reasons that people higher than me are signing off on, they're choosing to accept this as part of what we call our risk appetite.
So let's fast forward for a minute. So we know all those things to be true. And I think you hit one on the head with saying documentation. We talk about this a lot. You could say, I'm not going to do X, or put NA is not applicable to me. The problem is, if you don't document the why it doesn't apply, then you're going to be in trouble, right? Like, I'm sure there's another rhyme that goes with it, the why it doesn't apply. So let's speed this up a little bit and talk a little bit about, I have SMB clients, lots of them per se. Now what? Like, we can't just say a client's going, oh, I can't afford to have a vulnerability assessment. And maybe they say they can't have
that's so BS at this point in time. I think even if a vulnerability assessment is
let's finish the thought real quick, because I want to make sure I agree with you. So, like, vulnerability versus penetration test. I don't think every SMB can afford to do a penetration test. However, let's go back to what you said. BS. Talk to me about, what does it look like for an MSP to say, hey, client X, we're doing this vulnerability assessment, whether you like it or not, because the reality is the cost to me, the MSP, is so much higher on not doing it than doing it, right?
Well, in fact, we actually begin, so we have a documented sales process, right? And part of our client discovery during the sales process is we actually do a vulnerability assessment, a very simple, light one. But it gives us a lot of insight into their environment, and also gives you a lot of ammunition to be able to, oust existing IT potentially. So look at all the stuff we found.
And to be candid, when one says vulnerability assessment, my experience has been, I could ask you a series of 10 to 20 questions. That is a vulnerability assessment of sorts, right? Like, depending on how you answer those questions, I may be able to take away, we have some serious work to do based on what you just told me, and I haven't even looked at the environment.
Yeah, well, all I need to hear is three little letters, and I know that if they don't have MFA rolled out, then I already know, like, okay, we got problems.
So, and I like that, the three little letters. There's some other letters too, like, do you have a firewall? And if they can't articulate that, that always gives me a concern. I don't expect every client to know what model firewall off the top of their head, or the capacity or capability of the firewall, like IDS and IPS. But if they can't say yes, quick on, yes, I have a firewall, because I have had those scans, like, well, we have a security gateway, I think it's called. Oh, don't have a firewall. Thanks for answering honestly, right? Like, there are those scenarios, and like, you're suddenly going, what am I getting myself into? And as an MSP, what are the questions that you should ask yourself when you're talking to your point on the sales cycle? Are there client prospects you would just walk away from based on what they tell you about their environment?
I've done it many times, and we've done it recently, in fact, where it's 2021 and I'm seeing clients that still have 2008 servers and Windows 7 machines, and a lot of the same issues you and I have described. They're on GoDaddy Pop Mail. To me, that speaks a lot more to issues with the organization than it does with their IT, because you can't convince me at this point that the conversation hasn't come up after all the alerts and pop-ups and all this sort of stuff, that there hasn't been some kinds of conversations about, hey, is this something we should think about? All these alerts on my Windows 7 machines from Microsoft telling me that it's going away out of support, all this, the big freaking screens and all that.
So what you're saying is, this is a Kenny Rogers. I think it's Kenny Rogers. Know when to hold them, know when to fold them.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, we're much better at this point now in knowing, like, this would not be a good fit.
This isn't let it ride on a pair of twos.
The non-security one that I hear, and this maybe is a good tip for a lot of other MSPs, is when I hear something like, boy, it's really hard to find good IT. I've gone through probably 10 different IT companies in the last 11 years. I'm just trying to find someone who's actually good at what they do. Like, okay, have a nice day.
Right.
I guess there's crappy guys out there, but they're not going through them.
Sure. And, and I would argue that there's maybe a second conversation, but to your point, like, there's a lot of time that can get wasted real quick on somebody who's like on 10 out of 11.
Yeah. Well, it's the
So
same as with um, hiring internal staff. I think they say be slow to hire but quick to fire.
right,
Right.
absolutely. Man, we
Yeah.
just took cybersecurity, put it over here on a shelf and said, let's focus on business operational principles. And I think that's ties right back to cybersecurity, of course, all over again.
Yeah.
So Ken, as we close out, what's like one, you said a lot of great tips for the listeners, but what's one thing that you would impart on those that are listening to this, whether they are the industry at large or maybe more specific to the MSP-Ignite members?
I would say, for God's sake, turn on multi-factor authentication. You have no valid reason not to. I don't care what your VIPs are telling you. Turn it on.
Oh, I use Semantics VIP. Does that count?
Oh God.
Okay. Hey, so Ken, as we wrap up, where can people find you?
LinkedIn is a great spot. I usually cross post a bunch of stuff up there. I think it's just linkedin.com/Ken C. May. I'm also on the MSP-Ignite pages. I do have a YouTube channel where I post pretty much weekly little cybersecurity tidbits, and the channel name is InfoSec. It's INFOSEK. I'll shoot a link over to Chris for that.
Yeah, so we'll be sure to make sure that gets, especially for MSP-Ignite members, that'll be available probably on our YouTube channel. Again, everybody, I thank you for listening. This has been an episode of MSP 1337. Have a great week, everybody.